Everyone had been interrogated at least twice a year since 1945, and the Russians had kept transcripts of all the interviews. They had always been especially interested in our military experiences in Russia during the war. They compared the transcripts of our different interrogations, and if there were any discrepancies, they wanted to know why. They did not consider that memories could grow dim or that differences between the Russian and German languages could cause translation problems. The people they called were all convicted of war crimes and sentenced to 5, 10, 15, 20 or 25 years in a labour camp. A crime was eating a Russian chicken during the war or feeding your horse Russian grain or hay. That was considered stealing socialist property, and for that people were sentenced to a minimum of 5 years in a labour camp. Of course, Mikhailovka held no real war criminals. People who had executed partisans or committed similar crimes had been sorted out and dealt with back at Krasnogorsk long ago. As I began my 5th year in Russian captivity, I finally decided that I would never return home. Those who had been convicted were being sent to labour camps, and I concluded that the rest of us would spend our remaining lives in the prison camps. I, therefore, decided to learn the Russian language properly. Most of us knew some of the language, the daily things you had to know just to survive. If you were going to another camp, for example, you had to be able to understand what the Russian soldiers wanted you to do, so you did not get shot for not following orders. Now I decided to learn the Russian language systematically, grammar and all. We had ethnic Germans from Estonia and other Baltic areas, and many of them spoke Russian as their first language. I began to study Russian with them in earnest. Having finally accepted the conclusion that I would never return home, my thoughts automatically turned to my 2 sons. It occurred to me now that without a father to guide them, they could be brainwashed into growing up as communists. That would be the final irony. We had told ourselves that one of the reasons we invaded Russia in 1941 was to free the Russian people from communist oppression. How many of the children of the German soldiers who took part in that invasion would now be raised under communist rule, and how many of them would be communists? I knew very well how insidious and overwhelming ceaseless propaganda can be. If I were home, I would be unable to do anything about the Russian occupation of East Germany, but I would be able to give my sons a balanced perspective against which to evaluate communism. At the beginning of December 1949, we began to get rumours that those of us who had not been convicted and sent to labour camps were going to be sent home. I did not put any faith in such rumours, because we had been promised so many times before that we would be home by Christmas that it would be foolish to believe such a rumour now. Then, about mid-December, the Russians read a list of those who were to go home. We still refused to believe it, because we had been lied to so many times before, and this was exactly the sort of psychological game the Russians loved to play. We could not help hoping, of course, but we were afraid to believe. Then we were inspected, however, and those whose clothes were too shabby even for the Russians got something better. My clothes were still okay. I had my boots and riding pants, and I still had my fur-lined overcoat, so I did not need clothing. Of course, we all had the caps with ear flaps that the Russians had provided. Even though we were afraid to do so, we slowly began to believe that we were really going home. Finally, the day came when they told us to be ready to leave the next morning. We fell out the next morning and were searched. A guard took a chess set I had made, because I had 2 of them, and he said I could use only 1. They marched us through the camp gate, and the small number of guards seemed a good indication that we were not going to another camp. I do not remember how far it was to the railroad station, but we marched to the train. They loaded us into boxcars again, just as they always had when we moved from one camp to another. The guards were friendly this time, however, which was another good sign, and in the boxcars there were boards for us to lie and sit on instead of just straw on the floor. Since it was winter, we also had a stove in the centre of each boxcar. And then the final proof that we really were going home, they did not lock the boxcar doors. We could not keep ourselves from starting to get excited now. Even though it was bitter cold, we left the door open a crack, for fear that it might be locked again if we closed it. This trip was more comfortable than any other trip we had ever made as prisoners, and we were excited and in a great mood. We talked about the coming Christmas and what we planned to do, and we talked about our families. We sang our old army songs, songs about girls, and Christmas songs. The trip took several days, and we stopped in villages for food and water as usual. Sometimes when the train stopped, the Russians came aboard and called out some names of people who were then taken off the train and returned to prison. They did not do it at every stop, and it was not many people, but it planted terror in everyone's heart. The Russians seemed to be pathologically addicted to psychologically tormenting us. I tried to visualize Lilo, Klaus, and Alexander, but I found it difficult. They were just the photographs in my locket, and I could not visualize them as flesh and blood people. Klaus would not remember me, of course, and Alexander had never seen me. Reaching home would be like being born again. I planned to stop only briefly in East Germany, and then go on to West Germany if I could possibly find a way to do it. We knew about the division of Germany, and I did not want to live in the Russian-occupied zone. I had seen all of communism that I wanted to see. When we arrived at the border between Poland and East Germany, we got our release papers. At the same time our train arrived there, another train arrived from somewhere else with women prisoners. That was the first contact we'd had with women, except for the Russian doctors in the prison camps. The women had been working in mines, even though the Russians had promised in Berlin when we surrendered that all the women would be allowed to go home. We had used thousands of civilian female telephone operators in the Signal Corps, and the Russians had taken them to Siberia to work in the mines. They had spent the same number of years in much worse camps than we had been in. Although they were young women, they no longer looked it. They had not had enough food, and they had been worked hard, and none of them looked young or pretty, even to men who had not seen women in nearly 5 years. East German soldiers had to process us in a big room at the railroad station in which old desks had been set up for that purpose. They were unfriendly, almost surly. We stood in line before one of the desks, and when it was my turn, the soldier at the desk asked, "Where are you from?" I told him I was from Bremen, West Germany. I had made up my mind to get to West Germany, beyond the reach of the Russians, even at the cost of getting Lilo and the children out after I was free. The people processing us had no papers on any of us, so they just had to accept whatever we told them. When he asked for an address in Bremen, I gave him the address of Judge Pawelek from our group. Then he wrote me a railroad ticket to Bremen. He also gave me discharge pay of 300 Deutsche Marks, my release papers, written in Russian, German, and English, which said that I had been released from Russian captivity and the railroad ticket home. Then we got some food and got on another train. It was a special train for prisoners returning home, but it had passenger cars instead of boxcars, an unbelievable luxury for us. We were all wearing parts of our German uniforms, supplemented by Russian clothing, such as quilted jackets. And, of course, we all had those Russian caps with the ear flaps. I was wearing the same uniform, boots, riding breeches, blouse, I had worn into captivity except for my cap. In addition to the chess set I had made, I also had a cigarette case carved from juniper wood, the fold-out picture frame a friend had made and given me for Christmas one year, and a little box made of aluminum that someone had made, and I had won in a chess tournament. It was engraved, Chess Master of Krasnogorsk. The East German soldiers were overworked, because 2 trains of prisoners had arrived at the same time, and they had a huge job just to process us. We were the first group of senior officers and the first general staff officers the Russians had released. Being back in Germany gave us no sense of relief yet, because it was still the Russian-occupied sector of Germany. We could still have been pulled off the train and sent back to prison. The prisoner train I was taking to Helmstedt, at the border between East and West Germany, stopped at Leipzig, because it was a rail centre. Entering the suburbs of Leipzig was like flashing back to my childhood. Always when I had returned from summer vacations as a child, the most exciting thing about getting back home was the familiar experience of seeing the first Leipzig streetcar. The streetcars of different German cities were different colours and shapes, so a city could be identified by its streetcars. Leipzig streetcars were still green and beige. When I saw the first one, I was overwhelmed with emotion. I knew I was home, and all those childhood memories came rushing back. Familiar buildings began to appear, and finally the familiar old platform at the railroad station. The station, like much of the city, was still very much damaged from the war. Coming through the suburbs, we saw many destroyed and damaged houses, even now, 4.5 years after the end of the war. Leipzig was a 1-hour food stop for the special prisoner train I was on. I talked to the railroad people and learned that a prisoner train was scheduled through Leipzig to Helmstedt every day for the next several days, and that I could catch it any day. If I tried to use my special train ticket, strictly for prisoners of war, for any other train, it could have been dangerous, but I could use it for another prisoner of war train. Since there were no guards in charge of us or the train, I decided to catch another train on another day, but I planned to go to the station every day to make sure the prisoner trains were continuing. I went to my mother's apartment so I could take a bath and change to decent civilian clothes before going to Lilo's apartment. My mother did not expect me, of course. I had no way to let anyone know I was coming home. I just rang the doorbell. She could not believe it when she saw me. She gasped, and I thought for a moment she would faint. Then her face lit up, and when I stooped to embrace her, she began to sob uncontrollably. Tears rolled down her face as we stood clinging to one another. Finally, we found our voices, and we talked non-stop for an hour, mostly about what life had been like in the prison camp and in Russian-occupied East Germany. I bathed and changed into some of my old civilian clothes that I had left at my mother's house so many years ago. It seemed unreal to see my old clothes, which now hung loosely on me. This whole experience had the quality of a dream rather than reality. My mother fixed a meal of cold cuts and cheese with bread and butter and real tea. Food had never tasted so good in my entire life. There was no full telephone service yet in East Germany. Many such things had not yet been fully restored, so I could not call Lilo. I took about a 20-minute streetcar ride to her apartment. When she heard the doorbell, Lilo thought it was someone from neighborhood control because she had her lights on when it was forbidden. Electricity was rationed. When she opened the door and saw me, her expression was as unbelieving as my mother's had been. I was so excited that I thought my heart would surely stop. I stepped inside the door and we fell into each other's arms. Having her in my embrace was breathtaking, and I felt almost lightheaded. We just clung to each other, both of us racked with sobs. Then I saw Klaus and Alexander standing behind her. I knelt before Klaus and said, "Hello, Klaus," and he caught on to who I was and shyly let me hug him. Lilo knelt by Alexander, who was 4, and said, "It is Daddy." I said, "Hello, Alexander," and he looked at Lilo and said, "He still knows me." Lilo and I looked at each other and began to laugh, but the laughter abruptly turned to tears, and we clung to each other as if we could never part again. Then we sat down and put the children on our laps and became a family again. I was able to stay with Lilo and the children for several days, and it was pure heaven. I learned that when Alexander was born, Lilo had gone to a small private hospital, where she knew a doctor, before dark each night and returned home the next morning. The Russians had imposed a curfew at dark, and if Alexander had decided to arrive after dark and Lilo had been at home, she would have been unable to go to the hospital. The war had been over only 3 months at that time, and being in the streets after curfew was dangerous, because patrolling Russian soldiers would shoot without warning. Lilo had lived with her mother at first. They lived by selling their jewellery and crystal and clothing to the Russians. But then a Russian official took over her mother's apartment and forced Lilo to move out, although her mother was permitted to stay and keep house for the Russian. Later, the Russians attempted to revive the old Leipzig fashion fair. Leipzig had been a fashion centre before the war, and Lilo got a job modelling clothing there. From then on, she was able to make a living by modelling. Before I arrived home, Lilo had received a visit from an official of the Communist Party who told her that I would return home soon and that when I arrived they had a very good job for me in my old profession. That frightened me, because it meant they expected me and would come looking for me. Lilo and I made plans for getting her and the children to West Germany. She could get a pass to visit me, as long as she left the children in Leipzig, so we planned that once I got out she would visit me, and then we would make firm plans to get her and the children out. I wanted to stay with Lilo and the children for several days before going to Bremen. Klaus and Alexander had both been instructed not to tell anyone I was home. On my third day home, however, a long line of people had queued up at a milk store to buy milk, and Klaus called out to the milkman, "My daddy is here, but nobody is supposed to know." A neighbour who heard that came immediately to Lilo and told her. I quickly changed back to my smelly old uniform to catch the next prisoner train. I took a small, shabby-looking suitcase this time, and put in it all the film negatives that I had accumulated from childhood through 1944. When I had been assigned to Schöner's staff in January 1945, I had not taken my camera because I believed I would not survive the war. I was taking a terrible chance because I risked being sent back to the prison camps if the Russians or East Germans searched us and found my negatives. But somehow to leave them would have been to leave my whole life until now in the hands of the communists. I got on the prisoner of war train at the Leipzig railroad station. We pulled out of Leipzig and went to Marienborn-Helmstedt, at the border between East and West Germany. A small river separated East and West Germany, and there was a railroad station on each side of the river. The train stopped at the East German station, at the small town of Marienborn, and we disembarked. We all had our packages or shabby suitcases, and we were all wearing a mixture of our worn-out German uniforms and articles of worn-out Russian uniforms. They called us into formation, brought us to attention, and marched us across the bridge to West Germany, to the city of Helmstedt. The tension mounted in each of us individually, and in all of us as a group as we crossed the bridge, because once across that bridge we knew we were beyond the control of the Russians, and they could no longer pull us out of the column and send us back to a prison camp. When the front of the column cleared the far end of the bridge, the liberated prisoners broke ranks and began to cheer. As the end of the column melted into the cheering throng on the other side, we all spontaneously, almost as if on command, jerked off our Russian caps and, with a deafening cheer, heaved them into the river. From Helmstedt, West Germany, we went by train to a hospital near Bremen for a medical checkup. I was 30 pounds underweight and suffering from severe protein deficiency. Von Berkersrode was also at the hospital, having arrived several days earlier with our original train. We stayed in the hospital 3 weeks while the staff fattened us up. Lilo obtained a passport to visit me at the hospital, and we made plans to get her and the children out of East Germany. Children did not need a passport to travel between East and West Germany, but adults did. Our plan was for her to send Luaus to me, and then I would send her a telegram that Klaus was deathly ill and she should come immediately. The plan, of course, was that she would bring Alexander with her. When I was released from the hospital, I looked up Count Schwerin, who had been released 2 years earlier and had established a business in Bremen. He gave me a job in his business, and when I was established with a job and a place to live, Lilo sent Klaus to me. Since I had only a sleeping room and Klaus had to go to school, I found a family who was willing to board him for me until Lilo and Alexander could join us. Then, as planned, I sent Lilo the telegram that Klaus was deathly ill, and she should come immediately. The East German government refused to give her a passport, however, until she produced an affidavit from the physician attending Klaus. I found a physician who was willing to give me such an affidavit, and Lilo got her passport. By now, the East German government was requiring passports for children, however, and they refused to grant one to Alexander. So Lilo had to leave Alexander with my mother when she joined Klaus and me in Bremen. It took us 1 full year to free Alexander from the clutches of the East German government. My mother badgered the passport officials every day their office was open for the entire year until she wore them down. They finally found a loophole that enabled them to get rid of this pesky woman, the fact that I had been born in Brunsbüttel, which was now in West Germany. Finally, we were all permanently together. In April 1951, with financial assistance from the West German government, I entered the University of Rastasil, near Bremen. 1 year later, in April 1952, Sylvia, our first daughter, was born. In September 1952, I went as an exchange student to Antioch College in Yellow Springs, Ohio. During the year I was at Antioch College, I recruited sponsors for my eventual return to the United States. I was determined to get myself and my family as far from communist rule as possible, both geographically and ideologically. I returned to Bremen in 1953 and received my diploma in April 1954. I returned to the United States late in June 1954 with my family on an immigration visa. After working briefly on a construction crew in Yellow Springs, Ohio, I joined the international division of a large corporation in early 1955. I retired in 1983 at the age of 66. General Weidling died in 1955 in Butyrka prison in Moscow, according to von Dufing. Oberst von Dufing spent 10 years in Russian captivity and was released in 1955. His first 2 years in Russia were spent at Butyrka prison. Then he spent 2 more years in a prison in Orel, from which he was sent to a labour camp at Workuta, north of the Arctic Circle, in 1949. On the way to Workuta, he met Raoul von Wallenberg, the Swedish diplomat imprisoned by the Russians at the end of the war. The Russians had claimed he died in 1947. At Workuta, the Russians apparently intended people to die, considering the prisoners' exposure to the weather, the hours of hard work, the quarters, and the inadequate food. It was also dark several months of the year and extremely depressing. Miraculously, von Dufing survived almost 2 years at Workuta and then was moved to a camp near Stalingrad, where he received his first mail from home in 1951. He spent the rest of his imprisonment in a camp at Asbest in the Ural Mountains, and was released at the end of 1955 after German Chancellor Konrad Adenauer negotiated the release of the remaining German prisoners in exchange for improved West German-Soviet relations. Today, von Dufing lives in a small town near Cologne. Major von Berkersrode lives today in Baden-Baden, West Germany. Major Wolf became godfather to our daughter, Sylvia, but he dropped out of sight, and I have not heard of him in many years. Count Schwerin, now in his 90s, emigrated to Canada and lives today in Montreal.